Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Get Started Fast with Avid for Final Cut Pro 7 tutorial series. My name is P McAuliffe, and this is the lesson that you've been waiting for if you just recently made the switch from Final Cut Pro 7, because we're going to be taking the two applications head to head, and I'm going to show you some features inside of Final Cut Pro 7 and how simple they are to do inside of Avid Media Composer. Okay, short introduction here. Let's just Command and Tab into Final Cut Pro 7. Okay, first and foremost, what I want to talk about is keyboard settings, because obviously there's some differences between how you set it up inside of Final Cut Pro 7 and inside of Media Composer 7. Now, inside of Final Cut Pro 7, we know that what we want to do is we want to come over to Tools, and we want to come down right here to Keyboard Layout. Now, before we actually get into the keyboard layout, you'll see that we can customize our keyboard, we can save a layout, and we can load a keyboard layout. Now, why would we want to save and load keyboard layouts? Well, what's important to keep in mind is that inside of Final Cut Pro 7, the keyboard settings are directly based on whoever happens to be logged into the computer at the time. That's why if you have multiple editors using a single system, you're going to want to have different logins for each editor. Or what they're going to need to do is each time they come into Final Cut Pro 7, they're going to need to keep loading and saving out their keyboard settings if they save it, so that every time they sit down, they'll have their settings at their disposal. It's a little bit different inside of Media Composer, but we'll get to that in just a second. So to obviously get in and customize your keyboard is very simple. What we're going to do is simply come up to Customize. Now, inside of our keyboard customization panel, the first and most important thing to keep in mind is that you can have so many different modifiers. Now, what is a modifier? Well, a modifier, you'll see right now, we have no modifiers. So if I hit the F2 key on the keyboard, that's to log a clip. F3 is to find the next. F4 is to lock a video track, etc., etc. Now, what I can also do is that if I added Command to the mix, so if I held down the Command key and I pressed the number 3 at the top of the keyboard, that would show my timeline. If I held Shift and I came to the number 4 on the keyboard, that's to add a marker, and so on and so on. We have Shift Command, Command Option, Control, and to be perfectly honest, there's so many modifiers, I really never even got past the no modifiers when I had my keyboard set up. Now, the next thing that's important to keep in mind is the fact that if you want to make any modifications to your keyboard, you're going to need to unlock it right down here in the lower left-hand corner. And modifying the keyboard is actually very simple. What I'm going to do is simply navigate right over here to the File menu. I'll just come to the very first thing, and let's say we want to map New Offline Clip, just because you can see over here that it is not mapped to anything. You'll see with all the commands that are mapped to things, if you want to know what they're mapped to on the keyboard, it's very simple. You can look over here to the right, and I can say, oh, okay, Open is Command and O, and etc., etc. So to map this to a keyboard command is very simple. All I'm going to do is simply take New Offline Clip, drag and drop it right over here. I'm going to drop it onto Y and let go, and you'll see it has now been assigned to the Y key, and it's been updated over here to tell me that the Y key is what is going to give me a new offline clip. Okay, now if we wanted to save this out, all we'd simply have to do is to close this, navigate back up to Tools, come down to Keyboard Layout, and simply say Save Keyboard Layout. Now that's basically how you get in and make modifications inside of Final Cut Pro to adjust your keyboard. So how do we do the same technique inside of Media Composer 7? So let's hide Final Cut Pro 7. We'll just Command Tab into Media Composer 7. And you'll remember from our first tutorial series, our Get Started Fast with Media Composer 7, we talked briefly about the keyboard and how everyone's individual keyboard settings are linked to the user that's logged in inside of Media Composer, not on the machine. So you can have one machine login and have multiple users inside of Media Composer, a huge advantage right there. Now that's obviously the same for both Mac and Windows. Now to get access to your keyboard settings is very simple. We're simply going to navigate to Settings. We're just going to come right down here to Keyboard, and once I call up the keyboard settings, which are located right here, you'll see there is our keyboard. Now inside of the keyboard, we only have one modifier, which is the Shift key, but to be perfectly honest, you're really not going to use much more than what you have on the keyboard right here. But the question is, how do we get in and modify this keyboard? Well, it's actually very simple. We're going to use another tool in conjunction with the keyboard setting, and you can find it right up here under Tools, and it is appropriately enough called the Command Palette. With the Command Palette, you can simply come in and take any command that you can find in here and map it to any key on the keyboard. For example, let's come down to More, and I'm just going to add another locator shortcut in here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the modifier of Shift, and I'm simply going to hold Shift down on the keyboard on both Mac and Windows, and I'm just going to assign Shift F1 to be the add marker for pink. Now here's something that actually come up from a question that was asked to me from a viewer. The viewer said to me, Kev, every time I try to access my function keys inside a Media Composer, my Mac system, now this is unique to Mac and not to Windows, my Mac system is either raising the volume or lowering the volume or muting the volume. What is going on? Well, there's actually a setting that you need to set before you can get in and use these function keys properly inside of Media Composer 7. What we're going to do is we're just going to navigate right down here to the bottom to our system preferences. Inside of system preferences, we're going to come to keyboard, and what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you have set use all F1, F2, etc. keys as standard function keys, because if you don't, those keys are going to be used for example, F10 is to mute, F11 is to lower volume, and F12 is to raise volume, just to give you an example. So by turning this option on, we can now actually get in and use these function keys as just the standard function keys. Now something else I want to point out in here that's very cool, we also have the ability to get in and map anything from any one of the menus onto the keyboard as well by simply toggling the menu to button reassignment button. Once I do that, I could simply say, okay, well let's use Shift and O as our key that we're going to use as a shortcut, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to map video mixdown to that, just like such. So now Shift and O is for video mixdown. And last but certainly not least, what's very cool with the command palette is I can actually use the command palette as the active palette. Now what does that mean? What I could do here is I could just shrink down my timeline here. I could stick the command palette right in the middle here. If I happen to be doing a lot of effects work, I could come over to the effects tab, and now all of these buttons are active as commands. So if I was working, I wanted to add a keyframe, I could actually click right here to add a keyframe right over here in the sequence window. So that is a very cool feature of working with the command palette inside of Media Composer 7. Okay, so let's just close the command palette here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to command tab back into Final Cut Pro 7 because I want to talk a little bit about the layout of the Composer. Now I refer to Composer much like as in Media Composer we have the Composer window. So I'm just going to refer to Final Cut Pro 7 in the same way. And we basically have three sections that we're working with here. We actually have our bin or our project window right here. We then actually have the quote-unquote Composer window right here with the preview window and the sequence window representing the sequence right here. And of course we have the sequence / the timeline at the bottom. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well Kev, that's the exact same layout as it is inside of Media Composer 7, and believe it or not, that's no coincidence. Remember, if you want to be the best, you have to be like the best. So that's why Final Cut Pro essentially is designed almost exactly the same as Avid Media Composer, because Media Composer had the formula right from the beginning, so everyone else up to this point has essentially just been copying it. That's why this layout is essentially identical. Now, what I want to do is just talk a little bit about bins here for a second, because setting up bins inside of Final Cut Pro and Media Composer 7 are pretty much the same, but there are a couple little things that I do want to point out. The first thing I'm going to do is actually create some new bins by simply hitting Command and B on the keyboard to create the new bins, and I'm just going to create a few of them here. Now I've got 4 bins here, and now the way that some people like to work is they like to work in a tabbed setup. You'll see right now I have 2 tabs. I have the project tab and I have the effects tab. Of course, all of my effects that are installed on the system are located inside of this tab right here. But what if I wanted to have some other tabs at the top? Let's say a tab for each one of the bins inside of my project. Well, you know what? It's no problem. What we can actually do is we can simply double click on the bin to open it up in its own window, then simply take the tab and drag it from one window to another just like such, and there's bin 1, exactly the same with bin 2. And bin 3, we'll just do the exact same here, and bin 4. Now, how that works inside of Media Composer 7 is very similar. What I'm going to do is just Command and Tab back. Let's actually hide Final Cut Pro 7 here before we Command and Tab back. And you'll see that I can open multiple bins inside of Media Composer, much like I can inside of Final Cut. And much like inside of Final Cut Pro 7, we can actually tab this window as well here. Let's just say we're going to tab the sequence window. We can do that by simply taking the tabs that we want to add and simply dragging and dropping them, just like such. So you can see functionality works almost exactly the same from one application to another. Now something else that I want to point out, I'm going to Command and Tab back into Final Cut Pro 7 here. So you're going to notice that the Composer window inside Final Cut Pro 7 is very different from inside a Media Composer, being that there's only a few commands that you can actually see on the interface itself. Whereas inside of Media Composer, the best part about the Composer window is that you can actually have no buttons, one row of buttons, or two rows of buttons, strictly based on how you like to work. If you're a very visual person and like to have the buttons right in front of you, you can have access to a lot more commands, a lot more unique commands using the power of the command palette by simply taking those commands, whether they're from the command palette or from a menu, and assigning them to all of the buttons located at the bottom of the Composer window. Very nice. Now, one thing I'm going to do before I get back into Final Cut Pro 7 is I'm just going to create a simple title here. We're just going to come to New Title, and let's just create a new title using the standard title tool. And I'm just going to type in whatever. And I'm simply going to close this title, because this is a title that I created to work with on the project that I happen to be working on. Now, there's the title, it's in my bin. I can now take this title, which is a maximum of 2 minutes in duration, and edit it into any part of the timeline I might need it in. Now, we all know how to create basic titles inside of Final Cut Pro 7. What I'm going to do, just Command Tab back into Final Cut Pro 7. We create them basically using a generator. What I'm going to do is just click on the generators drop down. I'm going to come down to text, and I'm going to simply say text. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to type in some text, and I'm going to type in again whatever. And there's whatever ready to be worked with. But you know what? I just realized something. There's a clip that I actually want to work with first. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to import a file here, and I'm just going to take a motocross clip here, and I'm going to double click on that clip, and you're going to see there's my motocross. And let's go back to that text element here that I just created. Let's go back to text, and it's gone. Oh, well, that's right, that's a generated piece of media, so technically that media doesn't exist. It's something that's just being created inside of Final Cut Pro 7, and I cannot tell you how many times I've typed out some text, I've double-clicked on a clip, and then lost that text. The beauty part inside of Media Composer 7 is that once you get out of that title tool, it's always going to save a clip into your bin. So no matter what you do, if I was to, let's AMA link to one of those clips here, and I'm just going to come back to my footage, and we'll come back down to motocross here. Sure, why not? Let's go to motocross. Let's come right in here, and I'm just going to select the first clip, because the best part is that I can double click on this clip, do whatever I want to do, come right back to that title, and drop it into any part of the timeline that I happen to be working on. So you can see subtle differences between the two Composer windows, and you'll be up and running with the one in Media Composer literally in a matter of minutes. Okay, now let's talk about another very common thing that you do all the time inside of Final Cut Pro 7 and how we're going to do it inside of Media Composer 7, and that is basic color correction. Let's Command and Tab back into Final Cut Pro 7, and I'm just going to import a clip here into the main project. I'm just going to right click, say Import Files, and we're going to head to the desktop, and here's a clip that has the wrong white balance. Oof, that looks terrible. So here's how we would correct that inside of Final Cut Pro. What we're going to do is simply take that clip, drag and drop it down here into our timeline, and I'm going to select the clip. We're going to navigate up to our effects. I'm going to come down to video filters. We're going to come down to, of course, color correction, to color corrector 3-way. Once I have the effect applied, I'm simply going to double click on the clip, and you can see there's the color corrector 3-way that's attached to that clip. And all we're going to do with our color wheels is I'm going to zoom in on my shot here just so we have a little bit of a better view of exactly what is going on here, and we can just adjust it. And I want to find a part of this shot that is black, and we're just going to color correct this the best that we can, because this is actually quite a terrible mess up in the field. We're just going to sort of use back here as black. So all I'm going to do is simply grab the eyedropper. We're going to navigate right over here. I'm going to eyedrop right there. Now what we need to do is find something that's gray. Now I wonder what I could find in this shot that's gray. I wonder, how about the road? Or even right here is gray. So let's again grab our eyedropper. I'm just going to eyedrop the road here. And last but certainly not least, we're going to eyedrop something that's white. So we're going to eyedrop sort of right in here. So let's just do that right about there. And what we now have, if I zoom back, is a pretty darn good color correction. You can see that's what it was originally. That's what it is now, and that's how simple it was to do inside of Final Cut Pro 7. Can it be that simple inside of Media Composer 7? Well, of course it is. Let me show you how we're going to do that. So of course, again, much like before, we're going to hide Final Cut, Command into Media Composer 7. Let's AMA link to that clip. We're going to AMA link right here on the desktop, wrong white balance. I'm simply going to say open. We're going to take that clip. Of course, we're going to edit it into a new timeline. Now, instead of going in and applying an effect to this clip, all I'm going to do is simply navigate up to Windows. I'm going to come to Workspaces and simply select Color Correction. Now, as soon as I do, I'm now greeted by the standard Media Composer Color Corrector 3 color wheels. And of course, to color correct this, very simple. All I'm going to do, again, much like I did before, is I'm going to grab the eyedropper for the shadows. We're simply going to eyedrop somewhere in there. Exactly the same thing for the mids. We'll just eyedrop the road. And of course, exactly the same thing for the whites. And let's just grab sort of in here, I guess. There we go. Very nice. And you can see now the difference between what we had before and what we have now is that this is what we had before, and this is what we have now. Now, one thing I also want to point out, we're just going to Command and Tab back into Final Cut Pro, is that inside of Final Cut Pro, if we navigated right up here to our tools, you're going to see that we actually have access to video scopes right here. And you'll see that the layout right now that we have is all, but we could choose any one of the scopes that we might want to look at. Now, of course, the one that you're most commonly going to use is the waveform monitor. Now, inside of Media Composer 7, very similar. What you're going to do is you're going to navigate right up here to where it says Previous. Let me just hide Final Cut here. I'm just going to navigate right up here to where it says Previous, and what this represents is the previous shot. So if we actually had multiple shots, you can actually compare the shots side by side with the current, where you happen to be right now in your timeline, the previous shot, and the next shot. So you can see a great way to get in and compare shots to make sure that the looks you're creating are going to be similar throughout your entire piece. But what I was getting at here was what we want to do is we want to see some scopes. So all I need to do is simply navigate up to Previous, and here I now have access to all of my scopes right here. Very cool and very handy. What I also have the capability to do right from down here within the color correction window is not only get in and adjust the gain, gamma, and setup, or as it's more commonly referred to as lift, gamma, and gain. What we also have the ability to do is to access curves here from within the Media Composer color correction tool, as well as getting into the controls button and getting in and not only adjusting hue, saturation, brightness, and contrast, but we also have the ability to get in and clip low and clip high. So if you have any video levels that are way off the charts, you can simply get in and clip them. And if you take a look at that as I'm clipping right here, as I just drag all the way down, you can see there's the clip that's happening inside of my timeline. Now, of course, I don't need to clip this. I could actually just bring this way all the way back up to the top, and you can see that my levels are still within broadcast spec. So you'll see that inside of Media Composer 7, you have a lot more flexibility as far as color correction goes, as opposed to what you had inside of Final Cut Pro 7. Now, of course, by getting in and doing the color correction without applying the effect, as soon as we get in and make any modification, an effect is added right down here into our timeline, so we're all set to go. And of course, to switch back to editing mode is very simple. All we're going to do again is navigate right back up here to the top, back to Windows. We're going to come down to Workspaces, and we're simply going to select Source Record Editing, and now we're all set to go. And you can actually see the difference. If I come right down here, I can actually even match frame this to show you the difference between one and the other. Now, of course, I could also get in, just sort of crush my blacks a little bit to get this to look the way I wanted to, but that was just really something that I just threw together literally in a matter of seconds. Okay, so let's move on and let's talk about another common task you do inside of Final Cut Pro 7 all the time. And of course, I'm referring to moving clips around your timeline. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to select everything here. I'm just going to delete everything. Let's just import some files. Now, of course, importing files is very similar to AMA linking to, but you'll remember from the previous lesson, there's a lot more going on under the hood to AMA than meets the eye. What I'm going to do is just grab all these clips here. Let's just create a new sequence. There we go. I'm just going to grab 3 clips here. And I'm just going to just randomly pick parts of the clip just to drop in here because it doesn't really matter for the purpose of what we're doing. Okay, so there's our second clip, and here is our third clip. Now, what we want to do is we just want to move some clips around. I think what I'm going to do is just add one more clip here. And what I want to do is I want to move this second clip down. And what I want to do is I actually want to place it right over top of the 2 clips that are right here. So how do we do that? Well, it's actually very simple. All we need to do is to simply take the clip. I'm just going to drag it down. Now you're going to see as soon as I start dragging it, an arrow has appeared pointing down with a line below it. Now what that basically represents is an overwrite command. So what's going to happen is that if I bring the clip all the way down, let's just say right here between these 2 clips, if I let this clip go, it's just going to plow itself right in over top of those 2 clips, and of course leave a giant gap in my timeline. I'm just going to undo that for 1 second. Let's say hypothetically what we wanted to do was an insert. Well, you'll see again what happens is if I want to take this clip and I want to move this clip and I want to insert it before this clip here, you'll see that if I grab it and drag it, we're still stuck with that little arrow pointing down to that line, meaning that if I let go, it's going to overwrite that clip, which is not what I want. So how do we get around that and actually have this function as an insert? Well, it's very simple. All I'm going to do is simply work my way back. I'm going to hold Option on the keyboard. You'll see that icon has now changed to a little arrow pointing down, and as soon as I let go, the function has now been changed to an insert command instead of an overwrite command. Now the same is similar for trimming. If I come right back here in between these two shots here and I navigate right over here to the right, you'll see we have the roll tool right here. Shortcut, of course, is R on the keyboard. I can simply hit R, select the transition that I want to roll, and simply roll it back and forth however far I need it. Now, of course, if I want to get in and extend this clip and push everything else down, it's very simple. I'm just going to hit R twice on the keyboard to call up the ripple tool. Now all I need to do is simply come down, grab the side of the edit that I want to adjust. You'll see the icon has now changed. I can now simply take this clip and drag it down, and it's going to push everything down the timeline after that clip. The same obviously works in reverse. I can come right over here and do the exact same thing to extend this shot down, just like such. So how does the same technique now work inside of Avid's Media Composer? So of course, let's hide Final Cut. Let's Command Tab back into Media Composer, and let's get some clips to work with here. We're just going to delete everything here. And that's all good. I'll simply say, okay, we'll just get rid of it. I'm going to right click, say AMA link. We're going to head back to our motocross footage. So let's come down to motocross. I'm just going to select 4 clips, just like we had inside of Final Cut Pro 7. All we're going to do again, much like we did before, just grab random parts of these clips, just drop them into our sequences bin. We're already in the sequences bin. That's okay. We're not going to worry too much about organization right now. Not too much of that clip. There we go. Exactly the same for this next clip here. And you'll see that it literally in a matter of seconds I got this timeline set to go. And how we do the same technique or techniques inside a Media Composer is not with many tools, just with one. And I'm referring to the Smart Tool. Now, how do we activate the Smart Tool? The Smart Tool is actually located right over here to the left of your timeline. You'll see right here, it's not any one of the individual commands that of course you can use. What we're going to do is we're simply going to toggle the Smart Tool on just like such. Now here's what's really cool about the Smart Tool. You'll see that when I navigate over top of the top part of the timeline, we just simply have the arrow. Nothing has changed. But as soon as I come down to the timeline, you'll see that that arrow now changes to the red overwrite icon, meaning that if I was to take this clip right here and drag it right back on top of this clip and let it go, it's just going to plow right on top of it. But what's very cool is that you'll see that as I drag down, when I get to the top part of that clip, that arrow turns red. The farther down that clip I move, it turns yellow. Now yellow obviously represents the insert. Now all I have to do is simply take that clip, drag it right back. I'm just going to hold Command on the keyboard of the Mac, Control in Windows to snap to this edit. And as soon as I let go, we've now just performed an insert move of that shot. We don't have to get in and change anything. We don't have to hold any modifier keys. All we need to do is simply adjust where we're dragging that clip from in our timeline. Now the exact same technique works with trimming. All I'm going to do with trimming is I'm simply going to move right back to the transition just like such. You'll see that I now have the red trim icon. So let's just say hypothetically we're going to trim this clip's outgoing frame, and no problem. All I need to do now is simply grab it and I'm just going to drag down like such, and you'll see that we've basically overwritten the clip that's coming in behind this shot. I'm just going to undo what I just did, because what I want to do instead of overwriting is I actually want to take this clip, extend it, and push everything down the timeline. Well, no problem. Again, much like we did before, all I need to do is simply just move down a little bit farther. That icon's going to change to yellow. Now all I need to do is simply grab it and drag, and what's going to happen is that that clip's going to extend and push everything down the timeline. You'll see here we have it again. Very cool and very simple using the fantastic Smart Tools inside of Media Composer 7. Okay, last but certainly not least, I want to talk about exporting. So let's Command and Tab back into Final Cut Pro, and let's export this timeline that we have right here. What we're going to do to export this timeline is very simple. All I'm going to do is navigate up to File. We're going to come down to Export. We're going to say QuickTime Movie. All we're going to do is we're going to send this file to the desktop. I'll call this from FCP. And you'll see that we have it set up to export as the current settings. We're going to include audio and video, even though there's no audio, but that's okay. We can add markers if we want to. We don't have any markers. I'm just going to say none. And I'm going to leave it as making the movie self-contained. All we're going to do is simply say save. And of course, in a matter of seconds, we now have this file on the desktop ready to work with. So how do we do the same technique inside a Media Composer? Well, let's Command and Tab back into Media Composer, and let's take the exact same timeline that we have right here. All I'm going to do is just deactivate the Smart Tool. We're again just going to mark an in and out point here. And we're going to right-click right here on our sequence, and we're simply going to say Export. Once I have the export window up, let's just hypothetically create a new export setting. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this to be something completely different. We'll just change it to be Avid Pro Tools LE. What I'm going to do is simply click on Options. All we're going to do is make sure that we export as a QuickTime movie right here. We're going to have it same as source. We're going to include audio and video. We're going to choose the color levels that we want, which in this case will be 601/709. The display aspect ratio will be the native dimensions. The audio format will be stereo. And what we're going to do now is simply come down and say Save As. And we're going to save this as a template. I'm going to call this Kevin's Like FCP Export Template. Okay, what I'm going to do is just cancel out now, because of course you'll remember that I can now come in and choose any export settings I want, including Kevin's Like FCP export template right there. And of course we also have access to that over here in our settings. You'll see if I come down to the export settings, right here is Kevin's Like FCP export template. Now if I happen to have something else as the standard export template and I wanted to have mine as the default, I could simply just put the checkbox right beside it right there, and we're all set to export using this template. I'm simply going to say export. There we go right there. Kevin's Like FCP export template. Let's call this from MC7. I'm simply going to say save. And you know what? I actually just got, believe it or not, one of my favorite new, if you want to call it an error message inside a Media Composer. What Media Composer is now basically telling me, and this is a new feature in 7.03, warning, no clips in the sequence were found to have a resolution native to the project. Why? Well, because they're all AMA linked to, so they all technically have their own resolution that's different from what's going on inside a Media Composer. So what it's telling me is that this sequence is going to be exported as 1080p 23976 DNX HD 115 rather than same as source. So it's actually going to take this file and it's going to compress it to be that resolution. Do I want to do that? I'm simply going to say sure, do that. And now what's going to happen, of course, is that file is going to be exported onto my desktop right here. And I'm going to right click. I'm going to open this with VLC because, to be honest with you, QuickTime inside of Mavericks drives me crazy. And there you go. There is that timeline that we exported from Media Composer, exported as a QuickTime movie. Now, I want to point this out before I wrap this tutorial up, and this is probably one of the coolest things you're going to see inside this lesson. And that is the fact that inside of Final Cut Pro, at this point, you'd probably go to an application like Compressor to, let's say make a video for YouTube. But we all know how well that went. It really didn't go that well at all, because you always try to find yourself trying to find the right setting for Compressor, and then you're trying to upload it to YouTube, and what a mess it is. Not so inside of Media Composer 7. When you made your Media Composer 7 purchase, you were also given access to Sorensen Squeeze. Now I'm going to show you Sorensen Squeeze 9. You were actually given access to version 8.5, but everything I'm going to show you works exactly the same. All I'm going to do is simply Command and Tab into Sorensen Squeeze, and to make this file a file that's ready for YouTube is very simple. All I'm going to do is take this QuickTime movie from Media Composer 7. I'm going to drag it and drop it into Squeeze. There it is right there. You can see that I even see that it's 1920 by 1080. All I need to do now is simply navigate over here to Workflow, to Web, to Destinations, to YouTube, to H.264. I'm going to select the 1080p option, and because I've already set up a publishing option to go to YouTube, I can simply drag that right over here onto the clip as well. And once I click squeeze it, in a matter of a couple minutes, this file is not only going to be compressed, it's going to be uploaded to my YouTube account, ready to show off to the world. So I hope this lesson has shown you that a lot of the things that you do inside of Final Cut Pro 7 is very easy to transfer over and do the exact same techniques inside of Media Composer 7. All you need to do is sit back, relax, and go with the Media Composer 7 flow. So if you want to get post-production workflow tutorials and industry insight you need to bring great stories to life, head on over and check us out at avidblogs.com/post.